July 29th. We're looking at a 4-hour Bitcoin chart, and as we've been seeing these days, we mark supports, resistances, and the middle of the channel. I also wanted to show you this diagonal line that gives us a bit of the lows it was making when it was in an upward phase, meaning when it was aiming for 68,000. And you can see that at this point, it broke out of that phase and entered a new one. At this point, we're already in that bearish zone, which is what we've been seeing since last week. It's been playing around the 64,000 area. Yesterday, we saw in the video that it was going to dip below that zone. It dropped below 63,000, then went back up to 64,000. To break below 64,000 was a bit surprising with how easily it happened, and now the price is once again facing the 64,000 zone. Now, what are we going to see? I'm going to remove this diagonal. It was just to show you how it was going to move, or how it has moved, to give more direction, to put more clues on the table. What we're going to look at now, we could draw another diagonal to see what this downward movement looks like. It's always on the 4-hour chart. Now we're going to look at the Wyckoff phase we're in for the long term. But this is just so you can see how, by connecting the highs, it's given us an idea of the movement we can expect. It's going to hover around this diagonal we're marking, most of the time near the bottom area, even though we might see occasional incursions, because this is more than just math. Trading is a bit of interpretation, a bit of art behind what the big players are doing. I'm Mikkel Vasquez, and after 15 years in professional trading, I would tell you that the only thing that really works to see this, in other words, to see the price movement, what Bitcoin or any asset is going to do, in this case Bitcoin, is to look for what those who move the market are doing. That is, the big players, institutions, that very, very small group who are constantly manipulating indicators and price. They can't do it with volume. So what they do is take liquidity from retail traders, the small players, make their moves, they're in no hurry, and they show up in every time frame. What we do on this channel to forecast the price is simply look for these clues that I'm telling you about. Above all, it's in the volume where you can best see the presence of institutions, see what their strategies might be, align ourselves with them, and win like the institutions do, instead of losing like retail traders. All right. We've drawn this diagonal just as a simple example, not just so you can see the new phase we're in, but we're going to dive in like we do on other days. Then, at the end of the video, I'll show you the July challenge so you can see how it's going. There are only a few days left, 3 days of the July challenge, but I'll explain it to you at the end. All right, Wyckoff phases, which I also explain in my course. I'll leave the link in the description with a really good discount, 50% off. Let's go ahead and take a look at those Wyckoff phases. In the long term, we're in an accumulation phase, and as I mentioned before with the diagonals, we're seeing that it's entering a new phase. In other words, it's gradually aiming for 60,000. Right now, it's hovering around the middle of the channel, which during this long-term accumulation phase, the middle of the channel, that is 64,000, is proven to be very, very important. That's it. We've already set up the Wyckoff phase. Just like on other days, I'll show you this historical chart so you can see how a Wyckoff phase works in the long term, but applied to the 4-hour chart, which is what we're interested in to forecast the price movement for the week. We can see it here. It entered, broke through 68,000, and at that point, it was already signaling that a new phase was about to begin. We saw this selling climax very, very, very small, but even in the long term, I suggested that the accumulation phase could be starting, and that's exactly what we saw. We saw 60,000, 68,000, 60,000. It spent a lot of time in this 60,000 zone because even though it's from one extreme to another, from a 60,000 support to a 68,000 resistance, each approach is different, and each movement has its own characteristics. Normally, the upward zone is always slower, like it takes a bit more effort, and when it drops faster. But anyway, all of that is just general guidance, because when you actually see the chart in motion, it's always full of stories, full of situations that can confuse you. For example, yesterday's breakout above 64,000 could be confusing and make you think we're still in the upper part of the channel, when what's actually starting is the lower phase of the channel. That is, 60 to 64,000 is what we're going to see. at least this week, and probably for 1, 2, maybe 3 more weeks at most. It's going to stay in this zone. This is the forecast. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, we always have to look for the volume because the big players are like a dinosaur walking around. They can manipulate everything except those footprints, those tracks, because the weight they carry can't be hidden. What the big players do, or try to do, to hide it is to stretch out those presences across all time frames. In other words, a footprint appears, then 5 or 6 moves happen without the big players being present, then another footprint, and so on and so forth. The footprints are these volume spikes across all time frames. When we're talking about 4-hour charts in Bitcoin, we're talking about spikes above or close to 1.5. So a dinosaur footprint would look like this, and in the interval between one and the next, we see that the volume drops, probably to half or even much less. Okay, now we have that situation set up. We're seeing how the big players have come in here, for example, to prevent the price from dropping straight to 60,000, probably to acquire more liquidity. Still trying to make retail traders think the movement is upward. In this case, when the downward movement starts and then this change happens, it catches a lot of people off guard, and they play that game to acquire liquidity before reaching 60,000. We'll see that same game at 60,000, but in the opposite direction. They'll grab liquidity and do it over and over again. This accumulation phase, 68, 60, 68, 60, until their coffers are full. And as we've seen in the long term, the movement we expect, since it's an accumulation, is an upward movement in the medium to long term. 80,000, 90,000. But we need more clues in the long term to understand if that movement is going to happen right away. For now, we're not in that phase of breaking through the 80,000 zone and shooting up to 80 or 90. We're not going to see that, at least not during this summer. Let's look at the short term. This week or next week, clearly dropping below 64,000. Try to retest, the 64 zone, touching it, and then going back again to look for those areas that are very active on the 4-hour chart, which you can mark as I show you in the course. You know that it's when it turns around at different times, but in the same place, at the same level, when it turns around with a certain volume, it's telling us that it's an area of activity. It's not as important as a support zone, resistance, or the middle of a channel, but when the price reaches those areas, it reacts, and many times we do see it turn around. Very good, we have that forecast set. You know that if it comes back now, for example, it's July 29th, it's 11:15 in the morning, it could drop to 64,000. We see a spike in volume, that is a dinosaur footprint, meaning a presence of the big players, trying to push the price back up a bit to grab more liquidity. In any case, the move that seems most likely is to send the price to this area I'm pointing out to you, between 60 and 64. On the 30, 15-minute chart, what we need to look for, just like we did on the long-term and 4-hour charts with supports or resistances, is to look for important supports or resistances in this time frame. We need to look at the historical data and identify those areas that are very active, mark them, and see how the price behaves as it approaches that area. We observe the reaction that happens with the volume. I'll show you the volume again. Simple volume is the best tool to spot the big players. They can't hide the volume in any time frame. All right, very good. We would look for a significant increase in volume, a move into a reaction zone, and a certain shape of the Japanese candlestick. But really, the shape itself, just seeing a long wick, doesn't automatically mean the movement will go in the opposite direction. What a long wick tells us is what's happening behind the scenes. In other words, a presence, a struggle, a shift in the paradigm we were seeing. For example, at this moment, we were seeing these very long wicks. Suddenly, it reaches an area of activity, some very long candles. Then it gets to an area of activity and we start to see shorter candles. If we were to see, like in the previous candle, this red one, a very long wick, and now it started to be followed by other small red candles in shorter time frames, that would already be telling us that it's going to look for 64,000. In this case, we still haven't seen that happen. We've seen the wick, We've seen the volume, but we haven't seen the red candles continue. Therefore, 101 forecast is to wait a bit for those confirmations to show up, because the breaks at 64 have been a little strange, so to speak, during this movement. And you always have to be careful and adapt to what the market has given us. Very good. We've already set the forecast for the week, which is what we're interested in. The week, 10 days. And now I want to talk to you about the July challenge. I'll show you the trade I made yesterday. As you can see, leverage 10, I set a small take profit of $30. And when it gets triggered, that is, when it reaches that level, MEXC sends me a message letting me know the order has been executed. The challenge is that on July 1st, I started with a $500 account. And right now it's at $1,012. In other words, I've already doubled the initial amount in a simple way. No, I'm not trying to look for complex strategies. I just enter when I see that I'm going with the flow of the movement. I need very little room to make those 15 at first, then 20, and now $30. And whatever I earn, I will raffle off among all those. In this case, it would already be $512 among everyone who signs up on the exchange mxc.com and makes their first deposit. I'm Michael Vasquez, and this is Daily Bitcoin Analysis. I really appreciate you watching this video, and as I always say, this is not financial advice. I'm just sharing my experience with you after more than 15 years in professional trading. Stay tuned to these videos because the daily updates are essential for spotting clues, which are always different and always tell us a lot about Bitcoin's future price movement. See you next time.